call to order the afternoon session. Asian Experiences in China is the title of the session, and I'm now going to introduce someone who needs no introduction. Professor Daphne Ma is currently the director of the Asian Energy Studies Center and an assistant professor at the Department of Geography at Hong Kong Baptist University here, and an honorary assistant professor at the Gedori Institute at the University of Hong Kong. In addition to obtaining her MSc in Environmental Management in Nottingham and completing her PhD study here with Dr. Hills at HKU, Daphne's work has really spanned several different areas, including investigating the role of local states, policy capacity, and development of wind energy in Xinjiang, Shanghai, and Guangdong. She was one of the first people that I met that was looking at wind energy deployment locally and trying to understand how local politics were shaping that. When we lived in China in 2009, 2010, I invited her to come give a talk at Tsinghua University. And it was really a wonderful experience because her insights and practical experience linking the practitioners with technology development really highlighted to me how her scholarship links both practice and theory in new and innovative ways. And I think one of the really interesting things is not only is she a celebrated faculty here receiving the Social Sciences Early Career Award, she also, before coming to the university, was a journalist, and we were speaking about this a little bit over lunch, about how a lot of her journalist training really made her were skills that were very transferable to her current job as professor. So with that, I welcome Daphne and thank you. We're all looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for the very nice introduction. I'm very happy to have a good friend to introduce me. So everyone knows that it's always a great challenge in a conference to get everyone's attention back after lunch break. So I deliberately reserved this very best time slot for myself. So I'm very happy to have you with us today. And our topic today is about state, market, and governance for sustainable energy transition. And this is about a comparative study of what happened in Japan and China. So first of all, I would like to give you a little bit of the background and introduction of our research work. So you have already met most of our research team here, and we have worked closely with Professor Peter Hills at Hong Kong U, and of course we have worked collaboratively with Alice and a number of collaborators in the mainland China. So the project Margaret for us is not only about what Alice introduced to you, is more about public opinion, quantitative analysis, public opinion. Another very important part or component of our project is actually more on the governance and social and policy perspective. So today my talk is more about another side of our research work to you. Okay? Most of our projects are supported by government fund, research fund, and a number of university grants, and we in application for a collaborative grant for a French and Hong Kong collaborative project. So right now, our project has started our work, I think 3 or 4 years ago, and up till now we have, I would say we're still at the very beginning of our research journey. We started to know something about smart grid deployment, but it's still at a very early stage of our project development. Up till now, we have published a number of journal papers, like this one about Korea and this one about Japan. And we also have been working on what happened in Hong Kong. And as we take more from the governance perspective, so you can see that we're more interested in governing the transition, socio-technical system, the role of the governments that we slightly touched upon this morning. And we published a book with Springer. So now this is a background about the topic that I'm going to cover. It's about the development of smart grid in Japan and China. This slide shows you some of the basic characteristics of these two very interesting and important countries, Japan and China. Like Japan, high-tech industrialized country, whereas China is a rapidly industrializing country. In terms of the power sector, of course, we are very different. like in terms of energy mix, the post-Fukushima Japan, of course, now you can look nuclear down to 2%. So in China, is the energy portfolio look differently. And in terms of the electricity market sector, although both markets are partially liberalized, they have been introducing competition, but not yet completely liberalized. But in this transitional period, these two power sectors, they all look very differently. In Japan, there are 10 privately owned, vertically integrated incumbent utilities, whereas in China, there are 2 very major state-owned incumbent grid companies and 5 major state-owned generation companies. So competition has been more keen in the generation sector, but not in the grid sector. Now, it is also very important to see that the smart grids have been developed very differently across Japan and China. One of the defining features of smart grid development in Japan is the existence of the 4 large-scale city-level demonstration projects. Earlier today, we have Professor Tanaka mentioned the pilot project, EVs, in an island in Japan. Now, this is another set, much more larger in scale, demonstration projects introduced, or what I would say steered or coordinated by the Japanese national government. So these 4 projects were located in Yokohama, Toyota City, Kyoto, and Kita-Kyushu City. And this is kind of the first phase of the major smart grid development in Japan that were actually completed in year 2014 recently. Now, when we look at the smart grid development in China, of course, the defining feature is that the dominant and very important role of the state grid companies. And the approach for smart grid in China is more focusing on super grids. We're less focused on distributed, decentralized system. It's much more about building super high voltage, high capacity grid system. So just now was a little bit background of the case studies. Now I would like to discuss our perspectives and methodology of our study. As I briefly mentioned just now, our research team focused more on the governance perspective, and this is how we look at smart grid deployment. We see it as examples of governance for sustainable energy transitions. Sustainable energy transition is, of course, not only about smart grid, it's about renewable, it's about energy efficiency. But we are interested in using smart grids in a case study, and we are very interested in looking into what has been happening in Japan and China. So governance, the core ideas of governance is the interaction of state, market, and society, and how such interactions can be managed, modified in order to steer the society towards achieving societal goals. So when we put that into context of smart grid, we see that smart grid, why it's so relevant to governance challenges? It's because grid system today look very differently from what we would like to see for one that would more likely to support smart grid development. Say in terms of the power system, then we have to change from centralized system to a more decentralized one. In terms of utility-consumers relations, just now this morning we talked about utility-prosumers relationship. So right now the current system is more like top-down utility-consumers relation, but we can foresee that with smart grid developments, then this relationship will be very different. In terms of renewable, because of the new possibilities that could be brought by smart grid, then we can foresee that smart grid can actually foster more regional collaborations, renewable development in a larger scale that go beyond local scale. So in terms of market, this morning with Professor Abe and Professor Tanaka speech, we touched upon how important market is. It's about market, it's about pricing, it's about business model developments. So with all these changes then in between, of course, a lot of major governance challenges emerge. Another very important concept that we situated our research in is about the concept of sociotechnical regimes. Now, this concept is very useful in a way. It tells us how difficult it is to change our existing power system. towards one that is more conducive to smart grid. It's because power system, as other examples of technical regime, that they are very complicated. They consist of stable configurations of institutions, rules, practices, and network that automatically and naturally drive everyone towards the existing conventional practices. Like in the power system, is the conventional, we rely on fossil fuels. It's the path dependency issue. It's technological lock-in. So this concept is powerful for us to understand and explain the difficulties of the transition. Now, with our research team, we are more focusing in the state and market actors for some good reasons. State, of course, for smart grid development, the role of government in policy, the role of government in regulating the market. In terms of the market actors, of course, we're talking about business model development. We're talking about consumer acceptance, perception. We are talking about pricing signals. Of course, these are very important market players emerging. So back to the very basic, the core research questions that we ask is to what extent and how we can modify these state and market relations so that we can more likely and more effectively speed up and scale up smart grid deployment. So this is more to answer Professor Hill's question, is how we can jump from a lot of technological possibilities to the actual large-scale deployment. So now I would like to move on to discuss more about what we have found so far in our case study in Japan and China. And I have to confess that because it's not a complete project, so what we can find out now is quite a kind of preliminary findings, and we try our very best to make sense out of it and put all the findings in a couple of slides. So the first research question that we asked is, do we have a uniform Asian model? We started this project with a focus in Asian economies, China and Japan. And these two countries are very interesting for our research in a number of aspects. It's not because China and Japan, they are where many energy problems emerge. They are also the places where many energy solutions are being developed, say energy efficiency, say renewable. So we see that China and Japan, they have been taking the global leading role in this area. So that's why they are very important countries for us to study. And then we start with, so we are a research team based in Hong Kong, so perhaps we can do something and then see whether we can find out there are some specific characteristics in these Asian developments and how it can compare with what happened like in Europe, like in the US. Okay? But we soon find that the answer is no. China and Japan, they're so different, and then the way that they develop markets are also very different. We find that the socio-technical regimes, the structure of the institutions and rules and practices are so different in terms of how they develop smart grid. So this is some slide summarizing the Japan approach for smart grid. We call it a government-led, community-oriented, and business-driven approach. I know this is a busy slide. It may hurt your eyes, but let me highlight just a few messages from this slide for you. Government-led, in the development of smart grid, we see that the government, the Japanese government, they did play a very important, indispensable role in all this development in the past several years. These four demonstration projects, they are very large scale, and it was only possible under the very well coordination and leadership of the Japanese government. One example that I can show you is that like the one in Kyoto, Yokohama, Toyota City, Kyushu, they all focus on different but complementary aspects of smart grid. So in the end, what the Japanese government want to do is that with all these demonstration projects, they will more holistically know better various important aspects of smart grid deployment. So community-orientated is also a very important feature of the Japanese approach, is because these 4 demonstration projects quite heavily involve communities and local governments here. And business-driven, I think one of the interesting developments in Japan is that not only utility companies they are involved, but very large corporates like Toyota, like other I think Mitsubishi, Sharp, Toshiba, the big names. So that is let's make this model very actively with the engagement with the business sector. On the other hand, Chinese approach are very different. We see that it's a very important role, again, with the central government, but the central government play the role in a different way. Just now, when we mentioned Japan, it's kind of like a smart grid development plan with 4 major demonstration projects. In China, we don't have a national smart grid policy yet. But we do have a new smart grid policy framework, which consists of a set of energy-related targets and plans, like the 12th and the 13th 5-year energy plan. We have energy intensity target. We have renewable target, that sort of thing. And we have a lot of smart grid-related policies, like feed-in tariff for renewable, that sort of thing. So that is the interesting development in China. And then another part of the Chinese model is that the 2 state grid incumbent grid companies, they do have a major roles in the development of smart grid. This is a brief introduction of the 2 grid companies. They are geographically monopolized grid companies. Like actually, most of China is the surface is supplied by the state grid company. And the China's southern grid is taking care of the southern part of it. So you see, this one, the state grid is much bigger and powerful grid utilities in China. So they are interesting because they are state-owned. Like China will still have a partially liberalized market. So they are both politically motivated as well as profit-driven. But they do have important roles in smart grid in terms of planning and invest in these smart grids and the introduction of a lot of pilots of smart grid projects all over China. So just now I tried to show you that the socio-technical systems for smart grid in Japan and China, they are very different. They have different look and the structure. And now the second question that we want to ask is that in this very different system, what kinds of state market configurations work in this context? Because our project, we focus more about the role of government and market. So that's why we are very interested in the state market configurations. And we find that these, there are 5 or 6 important aspects of state market configurations that we can find in these 2 countries. So these are the role of government, the role of incumbents, the role of new market players, the electricity market structure, political system. Particularly relevant is the central-local relations. And also, lastly, is the contextual factors. So in terms of role of government, I just slightly mentioned that the Japanese government and Chinese government, they take very different roles. And then the role of incumbents, I think what deserves to be highlighted again is that not only the 10 privately owned incumbent utilities, but also the incumbents in other very important business sector in Japan, okay? in transport sector, in IT sector, and in other energy supporting sector. In China, the incumbents mostly we can see are the two great companies. Okay? In terms of new market players, we see that in both countries there are emergence of new market players, but how they emerge and to what extent are quite different. Say, this is an illustrated example from the case of China, the role of new market players. So one type of new market players in China is what we call solar PV householders. Now, actually, the state grid companies, they have huge size of end users, but only a pitifully low number of households they installed rooftop solar system in their households. Similarly, the situation in southern grid, pitifully low proportion of end users. So they are there, but they have a very tiny proportion of players in the market. So now the development of distributed energy, actually we can see that it's quite limited. Only 3% of the national installed capacity come from distributed energy sources. But in terms of new actors in Japan, this is an interesting slide that I would like to show to you. That Professor Wu and Victor and I did field work in Japan in July this year, and this is the pictures that we took in a demonstration house in Yokohama. So rooftop solar system installed, and then it's the factory for storing those solar electricity, and have a monitor showing in home is a monitor display of the consumption and electricity generated from solar. And this poster, I think, is quite important. There are actually three important figures here. Number one is that these real estate developers that built this demonstration house actually have sold this great number of houses that have installed solar rooftop solar system. And there's so many that it now that real estate developer has become the world number one. Okay? So the second figure that is important is about the satisfaction level of the households that have installed solar system. 98% of them who were interviewed said they were very happy with the solar system. So now another important figure is this one. It's about the benefits for these households. Up to 75% that because of they generate solar electricity. Now they do not need to pay electricity bill because what they generate through solar is enough to supply their household. So of course these figures, they give you a picture that solar development, this is a very important kind of distributed energy sources, are being scaled up to an extent that make everyone happy. Real developers are happy, consumers are happy, and that is, I think that's something important to note in Japan. Okay, so just now we showed you the more like general characteristics of these state market relationships. And now this is the last part that I would like to share with you about our findings, that we want to dig deeper. So what exactly and where do these state market configurations matters? And how state and market interact and with what effects in terms of the scaling up of smart grid deployment. So we find that these state market interactions, they are important in these areas. We are not talking about only market building. We, of course, care a lot who are the new markets, what are the new energy products and services, but it's very much about how the government can regulate the market as well. It's not only build, but also how to regulate so that the market can grow in a healthy way. It's also about industrial standard settings, about networks and partnership. Just now, earlier, Mr. Park mentioned that he would like to see collaborations in corporates be improved so that corporates would collaborate more sincerely. So we find that in these smart grid developments in Japan and China, networking, partnership, collaboration are also something very important. And we do see that government, they do play important role in facilitating this collaboration. Okay? In terms of business model innovations, then the point that we want to make here is that, say, for, say, solar development in Japan, like Toshiba is moving into this smart grid business, and the idea, what they are now proposing is that solar can be generated from an apartment, not only village style, but apartment is also suitable for it. And then the real estate companies, they can work out contracts with solar investors. And Toshiba can purchase electricity from these solar investors. And then importantly, Toshiba want to sell directly this electricity back to the household. So the idea is that Toshiba, they can take up the role of electric retail business solutions. But with all these good ideas and possible financial or business models that could emerge, then government still have very important role. Number one, in terms of introducing the feed-in tariff for solar, that is important. And then the number two is how to regulate these new market players. So we see similar ideas being emerged in this example in China. This is another site that we visited earlier this year. It's in Tianjin. It's the famous Sino-Singapore Eco-City project there. So in that Eco-City in Tianjin, there is an energy services company already there, providing water, gas, and heat for the Eco-City. And that energy service company actually has already invested in a solar project. So that is the current status. But it actually can take one step further. The prospect of it is that it actually can serve as a professional third party. So it's like in the middleman, professional middleman. So it can sell electricity to, it can help households to produce, set up solar electricity system and help these prosumers to sell electricity to grid companies. But now here comes the important role of the government as a market regulator. When we talk about this prospect with these people, and the first question that they raise is that, actually, is this energy services companies eligible to sell electricity in China? And then the answer, of course, is no. It's because the national policy hasn't provided a very clear statement that these type of energy services companies, apart from the utilities, they can sell electricity in China. So it's the role of the government to set very clear rules of the games and to monitor, to regulate the market players' activities. So another aspect of these state market configurations that is very important function that it performs is about policy learning. Smart grid, I think, very well is that the important role of demonstration projects. It's not something, because we're talking about very sophisticated, evolving, with a lot of integration works that everyone has to work nicely together. So not likely that we can have a perfect solution at the very beginning. The role of demonstration projects, how we test out new technologies, how we can try out technologies and see how our consumers, they like it, how they perceive the benefits, that sort of thing are very important. So demonstration projects is a very important process of what we call socio-technical learning. It's learning process. In Japan, what we see is that the government has been doing relatively well. That it set up, of course, the political system or policy-making system is quite sophisticated in Japan. Right from the very national level and then down to MITI, the very important agency at central level. And then it set up various deliberative committees inviting expert feedback and advice, and research committees focusing on different important issues related to smart grid. So with this more sophisticated policy-making system, we see that in Japan case, we can get the feedback from business sector through the demonstration projects, and independent studies, credible information, pilot results, and the kind of like feedback into the policy improvement process. And then these demonstration projects, they have to attend, disclose and share their demonstration experience through annual review conferences. So these are what we call more institutional arrangement to improve the policy learning aspect for smart grid. And we haven't found similar feedback or policy evaluation structure in the Chinese experience. So that is something that we want to point out here in this presentation. So with this, I would like to conclude with these remarks. So in Japan and China, we see very different systems have emerged. Our contribution are more in this area. We specified that state-market relations are very important, and where did they play important role, and who is responsive to these new opportunities. We find that the incumbents, in terms of Toshiba, for example, and in China, it's about the grid companies. And then there is no Asian unified models in here, but there are some important tendencies: strong government, strong state capacity in steering, mobilizing, but relatively weak in regulating capacity. And that is a very important part that the government has to take up. And then also interestingly, the state-owned utility and incumbents, we find that there are some very good reasons why they are the first movers, and they have been doing quite well for in certain areas. So they do exercise incumbent advantages. They help to speed up smart grid. But on the other hand, they can also create the barriers for the further deployment of smart grid. So it's it's the good side, but also it also another extreme is major bottleneck for deployment. So the another important ideas that we have to pay attention to is where the state has to expand, like especially in the areas of regulating, and also importantly is where to shrink. The government may need to rethink. There are some things that is better to leave it to civil society, like industrial association or the market. But on the other hand, then it also has to take up something very importantly. So that is the general findings that we come up so far with our ongoing research project. Thank you very much. Su Yan, I think we have a couple of minutes for Q&A.
But for example, in China, only 12% of the energy is consumed in the residential sector. So which means 70% of the energy is consumed in industrial sectors.
Yeah.
If you take this, if you take away residential sector and get into the major energy consumers, and so when you talk about state market relationship, and also if you look at what kind of solar, what kind of wind power they have in China, for example, also in Japan as well. 20 years ago, there were many in Japan was distributed solar panels on top of roof. But these days, we're talking about centralized solar farms, wind farms, very big. So when we talk about this, it's different from the residential sector. It's very different from the rooftop that you can still have. You have consumers and suppliers, producers of the wind and solar energy on the same roof. If you look at this, you think that this, again, is a centralized solar and wind energy. Can you get something new, apply the same logic, same questions, can you get something different from your study only on the residential sector. I'm saying this because if you get away from the residential sector, how smart grid is applied in the residential energy use. If you look at the elephant, not the 12%, but the majority of energy produced and consumed.
Yeah.
And can you get something different when you talk about state-market relationships?
You mean that move beyond from residential sector to industrial sector?
Industrial sector, for example, when we talk about 10 gigawatt scale wind farms, solar farms, it's not this 10 kilowatt, on the top of the roof solar panels.
Yeah.
So you can get something different, saying that the state market may have a very different relationship from what you have discovered.
Yeah. I think there are two approaches for renewable development. One is more like large-scale wind-based, which has been introduced in China, and the other one is the alternative, is the more small-scale, the decentralized one. The role of the government in regulating these two types of renewable development actually can be very different. Like for large-scale one, the role of the government is how to correct the utilities disincentive to allow renewable to get into their grid. So it's about whether there's sufficient economic incentive for these two great companies, so they can have economic incentive to invest in the extra infrastructure in terms of accommodating these variable energy sources. But in terms of another approach, the decentralized households scale of renewable development, the incentives is not only about the utility disincentive, but also whether households, they have incentives, sufficient incentive to bother to try these new things out. Because for many of these the Chinese households, the benefit is too minimal. They don't see the point to do it. But like in Japan, they have, because of the feed-in tariff, then the Japanese, they can actually sell this solar electricity at quite a very good price. So ordinary households, they can perhaps get more than 500 Hong Kong dollar because they sell solar electricity to the grid company. So this, the role of the government in terms of how regulating the different actors, how they work, how they respond, can be very different.